Hello, I'm Donny. I'm the designer for Know Me pattern number 2136. So this pattern is for a pullover fleece with a rounded yoke, and there are a couple of collar options and pocket options. So you've got your regular collar and a front kangaroo pocket for view A, and for view B, there is a hood and welt pockets. In terms of fabric, there's going to be your main fabric, your first contrast fabric, and your second contrast fabric. For your main fabric and contrast fabric, I think medium-ish weight fabrics, but particularly knits like fleece or heavy sweatshirt fabrics would be great. And for your second contrast fabric, that's going to be something more lightweight that you use for the placket, welt pockets, and binding for the sleeves and binding for the collar. And so for the sample I'm going to make today, I used a cotton sherpa. I used pre-quilted fabric that I made from various scraps that I've collected over the years. And for my second contrast fabric, I used other scraps of fabric. So here's one fabric, another fabric, another fabric. So it's a scrappy version. And so this pattern was designed with color blocking in mind. So you don't have to follow the exact main first contrast, second contrast like the pattern suggests. Feel free to be as creative as you want. So yeah, let's get started.
So this pattern has three fabrics. You have the main fabric, which is used for the body and the sleeves. You have a contrast fabric, which is used for the yoke and the outer hood or the outer collar. And then a second contrast fabric, which is used for the welts, the placket, and the inside of the collar or the hoodie. So for my main fabric, I'm using this cotton sherpa type thing. And I cut out my front piece on the fold, my back piece on the fold, and my two sleeve pieces. And I've already transferred all the pattern markings to the fabric, and I'm keeping all the pattern pieces pinned to the fabric just so I can keep track of it more easily. So for my first contrast fabric, I'm using this fabric that I quilted myself. So these are just squares from scrap fabric of previous projects that I pieced together. The backing is also just scrap, and then the batting is also leftover batting scraps from previous projects. And for the first contrast fabric, you'll need to cut out the back yoke. You'll also need two pieces of the upper front yoke. So 1, 2, 2 pieces of the upper sleeve, 1, 2, and 2 pieces of the upper back sleeve. So there's one, and there's my second one. So here you'll also need 2 pieces of fabric for your placket. So I have one piece here, and my second piece I pieced together 2 scraps because I really like this top fabric, but I didn't have a scrap that was long enough, so I just stuck it onto another piece of fabric. You'll also need to interface this fabric, but I did it a little differently. So I only interfaced half of it, and the other half I used a piece of cotton batting. And the idea is to get some rigidity and structure from the interfacing, but also get some loft from the batting. And I was just worried that the placket might look a little flat, too flat compared to the rest of the yoke if I didn't add a little bit of batting to it. So for the collar pieces, you're supposed to cut out one piece of your main contrast, or your first contrast fabric and your second contrast fabric. But I wanted to use this fabric that I pieced together for both sides, but I haven't quilted one of the pieces together yet. And I'll show you why. So here is one side of the collar, here's another side of the collar, and then my two batting pieces. So what I'll do when we get to the collar step is actually attach all my collar pieces together before I quilt the batting onto the collar pieces. And that way it'll be, I think, a little easier to work with than quilting and then attaching. Next I have my collar binding, and I've cut out the piece a little longer than recommended because I just like having a little bit of extra fabric to work with when I use binding. And I pieced my binding together because my scraps weren't quite long enough for the length required by this pattern piece. I have also cut out two bias strips for the sleeve. And again, a little longer than recommended. I just like having the extra room to work with. So I'm gonna do the welt pocket option for this jacket. And so I cut out two pieces from my scraps for the welt, and then they are interfaced using this plain woven cotton that I have in my stash. And finally, I have my pocket bag pieces. So one pocket bag piece, again, just cut out from whatever scrap I had that was large enough to fit the pattern piece. And then the pocket facing, which was also cut out from whatever piece of scrap fabric that was large enough to fit the piece. For the first step, I want to attach the upper front piece to the upper sleeve piece, or the upper sleeve front piece. And I've already marked my sewing line and pinned the edges. I've done that for one set. Here is the pinned pieces for the other set. And I'm also going to pin and sew the back yoke piece to the upper back sleeve pieces. I forgot to mention this before I started sewing, but I switched out the presser foot on my machine with a walking foot, and that just helps with sewing a really thick fabric together. So here is my upper front piece sewn to the sleeve piece, and here's my other one, and here is my upper back sewn to each of its back sleeve pieces. So now I'm going to press this seam open before attaching the back and front pieces together. Since I'm using this really lofty batting though, I think I'll just try my best to maybe give it a little bit of steam and finger press it so that I don't accidentally flatten all of the poofiness and loft that I have in my fabric. Okay, so here's one piece that I've tried my best to press flat, but as you can see, the seams are quite thick.
And I haven't, at first I was going to just zigzag the edges to finish the raw edges, but I think what I'm going to do instead is trim out as much of the batting as I can, and then finish the raw edges with some bias tape. Okay, I just finished trimming out some of the batting that was between my two fabric layers of this quilted fabric. So now I'm going to take some bias tape that I've had in my stash forever, and then I'm going to open up the bias tape, and hopefully you can see this on camera, but there's like a groove from where it was pressed and folded. And I'm going to line it up right sides together with my seam allowance and just try to sew as best I can in that groove. Here is the seam allowances, or the seam allowance where I just finished binding the raw edge with some bias tape. And then I gave it another quick press to make it look prettier. They're still flapping around a bit, so what I'll do is I'll just hand sew them down onto the garment at the very end, so I can do that all in one go. I guess I could sew these down now, but I don't want the stitching to show on the front side. So I'll just deal with this flappiness at the very end. I've just finished binding all of the raw edges on my yoke pieces. So now I'm going to attach the front and back sides together now along the sleeve edge or the sleeve seam, matching notches. So I'm just going to sew along this edge for both sides of the yoke. And then I will do the same thing as before where I trim out any extra batting between the quilted layers and then bind the raw edges with some bias tape. So the audio didn't record for my last couple of clips, but basically I've attached the front to the back pieces. I also decided to quickly hand sew down the seam allowances. I think I said that I was going to wait until the very end, but I decided to do it now while I had less material to work with. So now I'm going to move on to stay stitching the neckline because I'm working with a woven fabric, and stay stitching will hopefully make easing the collar on a little easier later.
here is the basted edge of the neck area of my yoke. So now I'm going to take one of the collar pieces I have and then attach it to right sides together onto my yoke piece, and then baste all the way around. I've got the first collar piece basted on. Now I'm going to attach the other piece, but I'm going to do this a little differently. So like I said before, I want to have a quilted collar, but I haven't done the actual quilting part yet. So I'm just going to attach all 3 layers right now to my upper yoke piece, and then once it's attached, I'll press every piece up, trim down the seam allowances, and then quilt all the layers of the collar together. So I've pinned all of my batting layers and my other fabric, or my other collar layer, and now I'm just going to sew over the line of basting stitches I made to attach all the layers together. So I've sewn all of the collar layers together, but I had a thought while I was sewing that I want to add in a little hanging loop for this jacket. So I have here, I don't know, an 8-ish inch rectangle of fabric that I folded over a couple times. And so I'm going to pick out a couple stitches from this collar on the inside, insert this in, and then move on to the rest. And of course, this isn't part of the normal pattern, but I think it adds, a nice bit of utility if you want to add in that detail. All right, my hanging loop is attached now. What I'll do now is trim down seam allowances and trim down on all the bulk I have going on at the collar here. And then I'm going to press everything up, and then I'll begin quilting all of my fabric layers at the collar together. Okay, so now my collar is attached. I've pressed all the layers. Well, first I trimmed the seam allowance down, and then I pressed all the layers away from the neck edge. And then I quilted all the layers together by ditch stitching between the pieced fabric. So now I'm going to attach the collar binding. I've already pressed one of the edges in by 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm going to sew it at a 3/4 inch seam allowance along the top edge of the collar. And then the instructions have you, well, after I sew it on, I'm gonna press it, fold it over, and then the instructions have you ditch stitch, but to be honest, I've never been very good at that. So I think I'm just going to, after I sew this edge down, I'll fold it over and then hand sew the other edge down. I just finished sewing the collar binding on this side, and before I hand sew it down, I think I'm just going to attach the plackets first because I'm also going to do some hand sewing with that. So here's one of my placket pieces, and I've already pressed and folded it per the pattern instructions. So now I'm just going to fold it right sides together along the center line that I've marked. And then I'm going to sew a 5/8 seam allowance across the top. So now I'm going to trim down the seam a bit before I turn it out. That way my corner stays nice and sharp. All right, so I turned out the corner and gave it a quick press, and then I also slid in a small piece or a strip of batting. That way it's not so flat compared to the rest of the yoke. And now I'm going to attach it to my yoke. So now I'm going to sew it right sides together. And then when I have this seam sewn down, I'm going to flip it over and then hand sew this folded edge. Okay, I just finished sewing one of the plackets on. So what I'll do now is, I think I'll trim down the seam allowance a little bit, and then I'll press the placket this way. And then I'm going to hand sew this edge down. The instructions have you ditch stitch, but like I said earlier, I don't think I'm very good at that, so I'm just going to hand sew the other edge to give it like a cleaner finish. I also haven't tacked down the batting at all, but I think it will be held in place once I add buttons and everything. So I'm gonna do the other side of the placket, hand sew, and then move on to the next steps. Here is my yoke and collar so far. I finished hand sewing down the placket on the inside and also the collar binding. I just did a slip stitch, so nothing too fancy. Now I'm going to sew on my buttonholes, and I've already added the markings here. The instructions have you do it at the end, but I'm going to do it now because I think it'll be easier before the entire jacket is all together. So I'll add on buttonholes before moving on to the next steps. Okay, so my buttonholes are on. Now I'm going to do two more things before finishing up the top for now. So first I'm going to stay stitch the entire bottom edge of this yoke, and then I'm going to lap the left side over the right side, and then tack them down at the bottom here. And then once that's done, I will move on to working on the other parts of this jacket.
All right, so the top part of this jacket is done for now. I've stay stitched the bottom edge and I've tacked the front, the left or the right front together. I also can't remember if I mentioned this, but I also added in a little name tag while I was doing all the hand sewing. So of course this pattern piece isn't in the pattern, but it's essentially, a rectangle and then a little name tag that I put on it. So this part is done for now. I'm going to move on to working on the welt pockets of the lower front. All right, so for the lower half of the jacket, I'm going to start with putting the welt pockets on the lower front. I think it would be pretty challenging, or this fabric would be a little challenging to sew on the welts because of the texture. So I've also marked all the markings on the back to make it a little easier for myself when I have the option. So the first thing I'm going to do is reinforce the welt stitch, and I'm just going to sew this rectangle, which is marked between the small dots on the pattern. So I just finished sewing that reinforcement stitch along this rectangle. Turn it around. You can see that it's, I don't know, I guess it's pretty close. Like it's pretty good on this corner. Doesn't quite match this corner, but it's probably close enough. So now I'm going to work on the actual welt. So here's the welt. I couldn't find the interfacing, so I'm just using this thin piece of woven cotton scrap that I had to interface the welt. And now I'm going to fold it in half and sew along either side where I've marked with fabric marker, and then I'll trim down these corners and then turn it out. So here's my welt piece. I've trimmed the seam allowances, I turned out the corners, and I've given it a quick press. So now I'm going to line up the large dot on the welt piece with the large dot, well, it's not large anymore, but the large dot that's on the center front, and it should be on the side that's closer to the center. So I line that up, it should fall within the reinforcement stitches I did, and it mostly does. So now I'm going to pin it to my lower front and then sew the welt onto the front piece. Okay, so I have already trimmed off a bit of the seam allowance on this welt, and now I'm going to attach my pocket facing. So now I'm going to match the large dot that's on the pocket facing to the large dot that's on the welt. It should line up pretty well. The small dots on the pocket bag should match the ends of your welt, and they, based on feeling, they mostly do. So now I'm going to pin this down, and I want to be very precise. So instead of sewing along this edge of the pocket bag, I'm actually going to pin this, turn it around, and sew exactly over the line that I used to sew the welt down. And that'll hopefully give me a more precise seam. Okay, so I have attached my pocket facing and I have also trimmed down the seam allowance. And now I'm going to do a similar thing for the pocket bag. So I'm going to line up the edge of this pocket bag with the seam or stitches I just made. And then I'm going to do a similar thing where I just pin this down to keep it in place. I'm going to flip this lower front around and then sew directly on the reinforcement stitch I did before. My pocket bag is now attached, so the next step is to cut open the actual pocket. And so I've drawn on the lines where I'm going to cut, so I'm going to cut most of this length, and then maybe about a ½ inch away from the end, I'll go out to the corners. And I'm going to get as close as I can to the stitching without, or at these corners, I'm going to get as close as I can to the stitching without actually cutting them. All right, now my pocket opening is cut, so I'm going to pull everything through. Or just the pocket facing end, pocket bag at least. Okay. So now I'm going to, I think, give it a good press, and then I'll sew the pocket bag closed. Okay, so I've given everything a press, and from the front, I think the welt looks okay. Actually, I think it looks really nice. Pretty happy with this. Okay, so next I'm going to sew the pocket bag closed. I think for most of the pocket bag, I'm going to use a smaller seam allowance than what's suggested. So this pattern has a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but I'm going to do a narrower seam allowance along the edge just so I can have a slightly larger pocket. However, at the corners or the edges of the pocket, do you see how I have this little triangle flap from where I cut out the fabric? I'm going to sew that down just to help secure it, and I'm going to try and sew it directly on that marking line I had. So I'll sew that down, and then for the rest of the pocket, I'll do a, I don't know, maybe 3/8 inch seam allowance. I guess it doesn't give me a lot more pocket, but it'll make me feel better, so. Okay, so I finished closing the pocket bag, and I think I'm going to use some bias binding to finish the raw edges of this pocket bag. You could just do a zigzag stitch, but since I started with the whole bias binding seams nonsense, I'm just going to continue that here for this pocket bag. So here is the pocket that I just finished bias binding. I haven't sewn down the other edge yet. I think I'll just do it by hand at the very end. So I'll just leave that for now. The last step for this welt pocket is to edge stitch each side of the welt. So I'm going to do that now. All right, so here is my first completed welt pocket. Here's the back side. And like I said earlier, I haven't finished sewing down the other side of the bias tape yet, but I'll just do that by hand at the very end. So I think I'm pretty happy with this overall. It's a little gapey here, or maybe that's fine. I don't know. I like it right now. So I'm just going to work on the other one, and then we can move forward to attaching the lower front and the lower back together. So here is my lower front piece. I've finished adding on the other welt. Here's the back. And I'm still going to wait until the very end to tack down the other side of the bias binding. But there's enough done here for me to move on. So now I'm going to take my lower back piece. Let's see how it goes. Okay, I've already transferred on all of the markings. So now I'm just going to line up the lower front with the lower back along the side seams, and then just sew them together. Now on the right side, it's going to be pretty straightforward. It's just straight down. But on the left side, we're going to leave a small gap between the two dots marked here. So I'll sew down to the first dot, stop, take out my needle, and then start sewing the next dot all the way down. And the idea behind this is to leave a small opening for our drawstring or draw cord later on. Here is one of my sleeve pieces, and I've already transferred all the markings on it. So the first thing I'll do for the sleeves is to sew the underarm seam together. So I'll just do that now, and then move on to binding the hem of the sleeve. Okay, so I've pressed my sleeve seam allowance. I decided to do it flat because it was too bulky if I just press it to one side. So I did it flat. And now I think I'm going to finish the raw edges with some bias tape. Originally I was not going to do that, but since I've put in all the effort to bias bind all the other raw edges, I figure I might as well be consistent. Obviously this is an extra step that you don't need to do. I'm just gonna do it for myself because I want to. Okay, so now I have the bias tape attached at least on one side. I've left it free on the inside like I have with the rest of the garment, just so that I can save all of my hand sewing for the end. So yeah, I'll just leave those alone for now and then move on to binding the hem. Okay, so you may remember from earlier in the video, I said I cut my binding a little longer than what the pattern has. That's because the pattern has you sew the binding on a straight line, and then it has you sew it to the sleeve, fold everything over, etc., etc. But I personally avoid a straight line like this for circular bindings if I can, because I want to distribute that bulk across the seam rather than all in one area. So I'm just going to start sewing my binding to my sleeve hem. And then once I get all the way around, I'm going to get as close as I can to where I started, pivot, and then sew a diagonal line. And then I'll try to show that on, I'll try to show each step as I get there, but that's my current plan. Okay, so I've sewn my binding all the way around the sleeve hem, and I sewed up until they meet. And now I'm going to pivot the bias tape so that they are perpendicular to each other. Might be a little challenging because my sleeve fabric is quite heavy. The bias tape is not. Okay, I think I've mostly got it. Okay, it's a little hard for me to show you because I'm turning it away from myself, but hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so now my bias tape pieces are mostly perpendicular. I'll straighten it out before I sew it. But maybe you can see here I have my point from where I've stopped sewing. And then I'm going to sew a straight line from where the two fabric pieces meet there. And that should close off my tape nicely. Okay, so I just finished sewing that line connecting my two ends. And if I turn it around, I can see that I now have this nice diagonal, which will help spread the seam allowance across a wider area and prevent some bulk. So now I'm just going to trim off the excess fabric. Then I'll give that a press. I've already pre-pressed the top edge by 5/8 of an inch, but I'll press this new edge flat. All right, so I flipped my sleeve the other way around again. What I've done is I've repressed this top edge just to make it a little neater. I've also pressed the seam allowance towards the binding. So basically, the actual sleeve goes up. And then now I'm supposed to fold this edge over. But like I've been doing with the rest of the bias binding on this pattern, I'm just going to leave this for the very end when I do all my hand sewing. The pattern has you ditch stitch, I think. I can't remember actually, but I'm pretty sure it has you ditch stitch. But like I said earlier, I've never been good at that, so I'm just going to leave finishing off the binding for the very end. So I'm going to do the other sleeve, and then I will attach the sleeves to the lower body. Okay, so now I'm going to attach the lower part of my jacket with my sleeve, and I've finished the side seams, or the side seam allowances, of the body of my jacket the same way, where I just put on some bias tape and then I'll hand sew those down later. But to attach the sleeve, I'm going to match up the side seams of the body of the jacket with the body of the sleeve. And then I'm going to make sure the notches match. And then I'll just sew along that seam. So the lower portion of my jacket is almost done. I've got the body and the sleeve attached. So now I'm going to attach the yoke to it. So I'm just going to turn this inside out, shove this in here like this. And now I'm going to match up all of the seams, the notches, and whatnot, and then sew around the entire length of the yoke. Okay, so before I sew it all together, I'm just going to show you what it looks like. So I have the lower body shoved in here, and I've pinned around the entire perimeter of the yoke. So now I'll just sew these layers together and then check back in. All right, so now my yoke and the lower part of this jacket are attached together. And now I'm going to press the seams flat, like the instructions say. And then I'll also finish the raw edges with bias binding like I've been doing for the rest of the jacket. All right, so we're getting pretty close to the end here. The pattern instructions have you fold in the bottom edge of the jacket by 1 inch, and then it asks you to sew a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge to create the casing for the drawstring. But I'm going to instead bind the raw edge with some bias binding since I've done that for the rest of this jacket, and then I'll just hand sew the casing closed. So yeah, I'm going to do that, and then when I come back, we'll add the drawstring together. So I've finished sewing down all of the bias tape on the inside of this jacket. I also went ahead and added on the buttons while I was doing all the hand sewing. And now I'm going to add in the elastic that's on the left side of the garment. And so for the, I guess you can't really see it on the pattern envelope, but on these samples, there's an elastic draw cord with a cord lock. For this sample, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to use bias tape, but I still want it to be elastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a small length of my elastic draw cord to the inside of some bias tape, and I'll stretch it that way. I'll have bias tape with a bit more stretch along it. And then I'll use that to, and I'll add that to the hem of, or the casing at the hem of this jacket. And after that, the jacket will be done. All right, so now I have my draw cord inside my bias tape. And you can see that I will need to stretch it a little bit to get it to fit inside the bias tape. So now I'm just gonna sew the bias tape closed, and when I get to the area with the draw cord, I'll need to stretch it to make sure everything fits. So here is the bias tape that I've sewed closed, and then I have the elastic area up here. So now I'm going to, or I already put in a safety pin, and now I'm just going to pull that through the casing of the sweater. And then after that, I should hopefully be done with all of it. So here is the almost completed jacket. I say almost because I still need to rinse off some of the fabric marker on it. But here is the hem, and you can see I've still got that elasticity to it. I've still got my flat-ish bias tape, which was the look I was going for. I might trim it down. I don't know. I like how jumbled and messy it looks here, but we'll see. So yeah, here's the front. Here's the side. Here's the back of the jacket. I'd say overall I'm quite happy with it. I like how scrappy it looks. I like that I was able to use up scraps that I've had or that I've collected over the years for the yoke. And I like the color palette. I don't know, very happy with it. So yeah, if you make this pattern, feel free to tag me on Instagram, or you can just message it to me on Instagram if you don't want to share it with a bunch of other people. And if you ever need help with any of the steps, feel free to message me on Instagram. I'm happy to help. So yeah, I hope you like the pattern.